The scrape of that bench across the floor is the sound I remember first. Not her voice, not the faces turning, just wood dragging against wood in a room that had gone quiet enough for every man there to hear it. My wife was sitting 3 rows behind me with the other women. I had my hat in my hands, my thumbs pressed into the brim, and I was already certain I knew how the matter before us ought to be settled. Then she stood. She had never done that before, not in that setting, not while the men were weighing a church matter. And what she said made me look down at my own hands, because in one sentence, she showed us that we had spent nearly an hour discussing a family's burden without once naming the person carrying most of it. My name is Jonas. I am a husband, a father, and the head of a household in an old order Amish community. I tell these stories because much of our life is easy to describe from the outside and harder to understand from within. If you have ever had to make a decision for your family and later realized you had not listened closely enough to the people most affected by it, you will understand something about what happened that Sunday. And I would be interested to know whether you think leadership means deciding quickly or listening longer than is comfortable. It was late autumn, after the corn was in, and before the ground had frozen hard. The morning had begun with a thin skin of ice over the water trough and a gray sky that made the whole farm look the color of old tin. We had driven a little over 3 miles by buggy to the home where church was being held. The horse's breath smoked in front of us, and the steel rims of the wheels made a dry grinding sound on the packed road. My wife sat beside me with a dark shawl drawn close around her shoulders. She was quieter than usual, but I did not think much of it then. That is one of the things I remember with some shame. A husband can live beside a woman for years and still mistake silence for agreement. The service itself was not unusual. Coats hung from pegs near the entry. Men and boys sat on one side, women and girls on the other. The room smelled faintly of wool, damp boots, coffee from the kitchen, and the wood stove that had been burning since before sunrise. We sang slowly. We listened to preaching. We bowed our heads. By the time the last hymn was finished, the windows had fogged near the bottom from so many people breathing in one place. The matter that kept us seated afterward concerned a family I will call the Millers. I will not use their real name. They lived several roads from us on a place that had been in the husband's family for 2 generations. The farm was not large. There were about 35 acres in cultivation, a small dairy herd, a workshop behind the barn, and 6 children still at home. The oldest was nearly grown. The youngest still needed help pulling on boots. That year had been hard on them. The husband, whom I will call Samuel, had badly injured his leg in a machinery accident during the summer. He could get around with a cane by autumn, but he could not milk a full row of cows, lift feed sacks, climb safely into a hayloft, or spend 10 hours behind a team. Men from the community had taken turns helping. I had been there 4 mornings myself. We repaired a broken fence, hauled 2 loads of feed, and brought in part of his late hay. The church had also helped with expenses. None of that was in dispute. The question was what came next. Winter was approaching, and Samuel was still not strong enough to run the farm as he had before. Some men believed his herd should be reduced. Others thought a young relative should move in for the winter. Another suggestion was that Samuel close his small woodworking shop and sell some equipment to reduce debt. There was also talk of sending 2 men every week until spring. Every idea had something sensible in it. That was part of the problem. Sensible ideas can make a man feel righteous before he has understood the whole situation. I was one of the men speaking most firmly. I had run numbers on a scrap of paper the evening before, feed costs, milk checks, what 15 fewer cows might save. How many work hours could reasonably be covered by neighbors without neglecting our own farms? I had talked to Samuel twice. He was embarrassed by the help he already needed, and I believed the kindest thing was to make a plan that returned some order to his household. That word mattered to me then, order. I thought order was the same thing as relief. I thought if we could reduce the number of moving parts, the strain would lessen. So when the discussion began, I laid out my view. Reduce the herd before winter. Keep the best milkers. Sell what could be sold at a fair price. Let his oldest son take more of the barn work. Arrange a rotating schedule among the men for the jobs Samuel could not do. It sounded measured, responsible. I remember seeing two men nod. That small sign of agreement settled me even more deeply into my own opinion. Other men added to it. One suggested which cattle buyer might offer the best price. Another had an idea for the shop equipment. Someone spoke about firewood. Someone else about transportation for appointments. We were doing what men in our community are accustomed to doing when trouble enters a household. We were trying to put our shoulders under it. There is goodness in that. I do not want to pretend otherwise. I have seen barns rebuilt after fire because dozens of people arrived before sunrise. I have seen hospital bills carried quietly by people who never asked for thanks. I have seen widows' woodpiles filled, fields harvested for sick neighbors, and meals delivered for weeks. Community is not an idea to us. It is work. It has weight. It leaves mud on your boots. But a strength can become a weakness when you assume the thing you know how to give is the thing another person most needs. That morning, every plan we discussed was built around Samuel, his injury, his work, his pride, his farm, his recovery. We spoke of his oldest son's labor because it related to Samuel's work. We spoke of the younger children because they affected Samuel's schedule. We spoke of his wife mostly as someone who could perhaps manage more of the house while others handled the barn. I can see now how strange that sentence is. I did not see it then. My wife had been to their home far more often than I had, not to repair fence or carry feed. She had gone with bread, soup, canned fruit, and laundry soap. She had sat at their kitchen table. She had helped with mending. She had watched the younger children while Samuel's wife traveled with him for medical care. She knew what the house looked like at 6 in the evening after a day when everyone had needed something. I knew what the barn looked like at 6 in the morning. We were both seeing the same family's hardship, but from opposite doors. The discussion went on. I could hear benches creak now and then behind us. Outside, a horse stamped against frozen ground. Someone added another piece of wood to the stove, and the iron door clanged shut. I remember feeling impatient. We had already spent nearly an hour. In my mind, the answer was clear enough. A smaller herd, a work schedule, less debt, winter help. I was ready for the bishop and ministers to bring the matter to a close. Then one older man said something about how Samuel's wife was fortunate to have so many people making sure her husband could keep the farm. No one meant harm by it. I probably would have agreed if you had asked me 5 minutes earlier. That was when the bench scraped. At first I thought someone was leaving because a child needed tending. Then I turned enough to see my wife standing. She was not angry. That matters. Her face was pale, and she held her hands together at her waist. I could tell by the way her fingers were pressed that standing there cost her something. She did not look at me. She looked toward the front of the room. Then she said, "You keep asking what Samuel can carry, but none of you have asked what his wife is already carrying." That was all. One sentence. She sat down. Nobody answered. I do not mean there was a dramatic silence like you might hear in a story where everyone suddenly understands everything at once. It was heavier and more ordinary than that. A man cleared his throat and then stopped. Someone shifted a boot. The stove ticked as the iron cooled between fires. I stared at the floorboards. They were old pine, rubbed smooth in the center by generations of feet. I knew immediately that she was right, and I also knew I had not wanted to know it. That is a difficult thing for a man to admit. It would have been easier if her words had been unfair. I could have defended myself. I could have pointed to the mornings I had helped Samuel. I could have shown the figures I had written down. I could have said that the men were only trying to help. All of that would have been true. None of it would have answered her. We had asked Samuel what he needed in the barn. We had asked what work he could still do. We had asked whether he could manage financially if the herd was cut. We had not asked his wife what she needed to keep the household standing. We had not asked how many nights she had slept without waking to check whether he needed help getting out of bed. We had not asked how often she had carried water, managed the children, kept meals on time, handled visitors, washed muddy clothes, and tried not to let her husband see how tired she was. I had been inside their kitchen twice since the accident. Both times I had noticed the disorder. Dishes stacked beside the wash basin, a basket of unfolded clothes near the wall, school papers on the table, mud tracked by the back door. I had seen those things as signs that the household was under strain. My wife had seen them as the strain itself. There is a difference. After a while, the bishop asked that the matter not be settled that morning. We would speak with the family again, this time differently. That decision probably took less than a minute. It changed more than the plan for one farm. On the buggy ride home, I did not say much. Neither did my wife. The road had softened a little where the weak sun touched it, and every turn of the wheels sent small flecks of mud against the buggy body. I was not angry with her. I want to be clear about that. I was embarrassed, but not because she had spoken. I was embarrassed because I had been certain. Certainty can make embarrassment sting more than correction does. I kept thinking about the evening before, when I had sat at our own kitchen table with my paper and pencil while she worked nearby. She had known where I was going with my numbers. She could have told me then that I was missing something. Maybe she thought I would hear it better if I came to it myself. Maybe she had not yet decided to speak. I never asked her to explain the timing. Some moments do not become clearer by pulling them apart. When we reached home, I unharnessed the horse and carried the tack inside. The leather was cold and stiff under my fingers. I swept a little dried mud from the buggy floor, then stood in the barn longer than I needed to. A man sometimes invents one more small job when he is not ready to walk into the house and face what he has learned about himself. What troubled me was not that I had failed to notice another household's burden. It was the possibility that I was doing the same thing in my own. I began counting the things my wife carried that I rarely named because they did not appear in my ledger. Meals, mending, garden work, children waking sick in the night, remembering who needed shoes, knowing which neighbor had just lost a parent, keeping track of jars in the cellar, seeing when one of our children had grown quiet and needed to be drawn out, preparing for church, cleaning after muddy days, helping her mother, helping mine, listening to me speak about decisions I believed were mine to make, then living with the consequences of those decisions beside me. I provided for my family. I worked hard. I still believe those things mattered, and I do not apologize for taking seriously the responsibility of leading a household. But that afternoon I understood more clearly that leadership can become a kind of blindness if a man only notices burdens that look like his own. The following week, several of us went back to the miller's home. This time the visit began in the kitchen, not the barn. We asked what was hardest. We listened longer. Some of what we had planned still made sense. The herd did need to be smaller through winter. Samuel did need help with heavy work. But the largest change was not in the barn plan. It was in the way the community divided the help. Instead of sending only men for farm labor, families arranged help that reached the whole household. A few women rotated laundry and meals. One family took the younger children for part of a day each week. Transportation was arranged without making Samuel's wife ask every time. The oldest son still worked hard, but we stopped building the entire winter plan around the assumption that he could replace his father's labor without cost to himself. We also kept the woodworking shop open. That surprised me. I had thought selling the equipment was obvious. But the shop gave Samuel work he could do seated for part of the day. It gave him a place to contribute while his leg healed. What looked like unnecessary equipment on my paper was, to him, a piece of dignity. Again, the numbers had not been wrong. They had simply been incomplete. That winter was not easy for the Millers. Help does not turn hardship into a pleasant story. Samuel's leg healed slowly. Money stayed tight. There were days when plans failed because weather, sickness, or our own chores got in the way. But they came through the winter with the farm intact and with less strain in the house than there might have been. By spring, Samuel could manage more of the barn again. I remember the first morning I saw him carry a full pail without setting it down halfway. He moved carefully, but he moved on his own. I felt relief. I also remember looking toward the kitchen window and thinking about all the work that had happened behind that glass while the rest of us were watching the barn. Years have passed since that Sunday, and people sometimes assume the lesson was that my wife challenged the men. That is not quite how I hold it. The lesson was that she told the truth when the truth was needed, and the rest of us had enough sense eventually to hear it. There is a temptation to turn a moment like that into a contest between husbands and wives, men and women, authority and rebellion. That would make it simpler than it was. My wife did not stand because she wanted my place. She stood because the way we were using our place had left someone unseen. That distinction matters to me. In our life, responsibilities are often divided clearly. I am comfortable with that. I have found meaning in being responsible for my household, in working, deciding, protecting, providing, and answering for what happens under my roof. But responsibility does not make a man all-seeing. If anything, the more authority you carry, the more dangerous it is to believe that you see the whole field from where you stand. I think of farm work when I try to explain this. From the wagon seat, a field can look evenly cut. Walk the far edge, and you may find a strip the mower missed because the ground dipped where you could not see it. The answer is not to throw away the mower. The answer is to get down and look from another place. Marriage has been like that for me. There are things I see first. There are things my wife sees before I do. A household becomes stronger when neither of us pretends otherwise. I wish I could tell you I learned that lesson once and never needed it again. I have needed it many times. A son can be struggling, and I will notice his unfinished chores, while my wife notices that he has stopped singing while he works. A daughter can be worried, and I will notice she is moving slowly, while my wife notices she is avoiding one particular subject. A neighbor can need help, and I will begin calculating hours, while my wife is already wondering who has been sleeping badly. Neither way of seeing is complete by itself. That Sunday simply made the difference impossible for me to ignore. I also learned something about being corrected in public. Most men do not enjoy it. I do not. Pride has a way of dressing itself in respectable clothes. It tells you that you are defending order, protecting your role, preventing confusion. Sometimes you are. Sometimes you are only protecting yourself from the discomfort of being wrong, where other people can see it. I had to decide which kind of discomfort I was feeling. If I had punished my wife with coldness for speaking, or spent the ride home explaining why her timing was improper, I might have preserved my pride for a day and damaged something more valuable for years. Instead, I let the embarrassment do its work. It showed me where I was tender because I had been too sure of myself. That does not mean every public challenge is wise. It does not mean every strong feeling should be spoken in every setting. We still believe in order. We still believe words should be weighed before they are released. My wife believed that too. Perhaps that is why her sentence carried such force. She was not known for interrupting. She was not trying to be seen. When a quiet person stands, people notice because they know it probably cost something. When we spoke about it later, there was no long argument between us. I did not ask her to apologize. She did not ask me to praise her. Life went on. Supper needed to be eaten. Children needed to prepare for the week. The horse needed water. But something in me had shifted. Since then, when I am faced with a decision that touches the whole household, I try to ask a question before I announce an answer. What am I not seeing from where I stand? Sometimes the answer comes from my wife, sometimes from one of my children, sometimes from a man I was prepared to disagree with. Sometimes I do not discover it until after I have made the wrong choice. I am still learning. I suppose that is part of being a husband and father that no one can finish teaching you beforehand. You can inherit rules. You can inherit habits. You can inherit a good example from your father if you are fortunate. But sooner or later, your own family will place you in a situation no example fits exactly. Then character is not shown only by whether you can make a decision. It is shown by whether truth can still reach you after you have made up your mind. When I remember that Sunday now, I do not first see a room full of men being silenced. I see my wife's hands held together at her waist. I see the effort it took for her to stand. I see my own thumbs pressed into the brim of my hat. And I remember the feeling of realizing that I had brought a careful answer to the wrong question. That has stayed with me. Providing is not only bringing in money, feed, wood, or food. Leading is not only speaking first or deciding last. Sometimes the most responsible thing a man can do is make enough room for someone else to show him the part of the burden he cannot see. If you have a family, I hope you have someone in your life who can tell you that kind of truth. More importantly, I hope you have made it safe enough for them to tell you. If stories like this help you understand Amish life from inside a household rather than from a distance, you can subscribe and stay with me for the next one. And in the comments, tell me this. When someone you trust tells you that you are missing something important, is your first instinct to defend yourself or to listen? I have been both kinds of man. I know which one I am trying to become.